Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. These old cold winter days call for something rib-sticking, tummy-warming, soul-feeding soup. And this is my Creole Gumbo. That's as opposed to Cajun Gumbo. There's not a lot of difference. There's some difference. I'll tell you the differences as we go along. If you enjoy our channel, please give us a subscribe and a thumbs up, and click the little bell icon for a notice when I post new videos. Now let's get cooking. So we'll go over the ingredients, and I won't go deeply into the difference between Cajun and Creole cooking, but the Creole has more tomato in it and more seafood. This is some home canned tomato sauce that I'm going to use. And I have chicken. And that chicken was just dried and sprinkled with salt and paprika. And this is andouille sausage. And you know, I made a mistake and I got the really spicy andouille sausage. This is a can of white crab meat. It's not the big flaky stuff. It's like the body meat. This is a big onion, and I sliced it French cut. You can chop it if you'd rather. And this is a red pepper and celery. Usually it calls for green pepper. I just prefer red pepper. They pretty much taste the same. That's a cup of flour. This is a cup of oil. And then back here I've got chicken broth, 2 quarts of chicken broth. You can use fish broth, by the way, if you have it. You pretty much have to make that. I never see it in the stores. I will also use a pound of shrimp and 2 cups of okra, either fresh or frozen. And this little spice that you might not be familiar with. This is called filet powder. And it is dried ground sassafras leaves. In this dish, it is a thickener, but it also has just a wonderful flavor that to me is distinctive to gumbo. So if you've never tried this, get some. I got it at the Kroger. You can get it at Amazon. It really, really makes your gumbo distinctive. So we're going to start by browning the meat. And this is the andouille sausage. And I'm going to have one of those do as I say, not as I do moments here. I cut this very inconsistently, and I don't know why I did it that way, but I did. I've got some little tiny pieces here and some big ones. You can cut it. You can basically cut this any way you want to, but you should cut it all at about the same size. I end up with some little dark pieces, these smaller pieces. I don't know, some days I wish I could borrow my younger brain. And this is my piece of chicken. I'm using a chicken thigh. You can use a chicken breast, but a thigh is just so much more moist. Now, all I'm doing here, I'm not going to cook any of this done. I'm just going to cook it long enough to get a little brown on it. My main purpose is to get this lovely fond in the pan. Now, while everything else is cooking, I will chop that chicken up into small pieces. But I've got this beautiful, aromatic, tasty fond at the bottom of the pan, and I'm going to scrape it all loose. It did stick just a little bit. This is my field skillet, and it's not the skillet's fault it stuck. So we want this fond because we're going to make a roux, and the roux is what makes this gumbo. It's a special roux, and I'm going to show it to you. This is my cup of flour in the fat that I use to brown the chicken and the sausage. So you know there's a lot of flavor in that fat. And this is a little different. Actually, it's very different from the normal roux you would make. And the process is a little different. I don't know exactly how much oil I had, but I put all the flour in, and I'm going to add oil as I go until all of the flour is incorporated into the oil. And I have to really stir. I have a metal whisk here and a metal pan. And no, this doesn't hurt your cast iron pan. And I'm just going to gradually bring it in. And I'll add the oil until I can get all the flour incorporated in. Now, and I'm going to have to get something besides a whisk to stir this because it's stuck around the edges. But the roux for gumbo is different than any other roux that you make. And we're going to make what we call a chocolate roux. You're going to cook it way beyond any other roux. You're going to cook it, I think this took 40 minutes. My heat is on medium-low, just enough to keep a good bubble going. You can judge that by your stove. You see I've got it all incorporated in there. I've got plenty of oil. Something I sometimes say about gumbo is there's two ways to make it. You can do it quick or you can do it right. See all these bubbles? This roux has lots of bubbles in it. That's what you always get when you make a roux, like you're making gravy or whatever. By the time I'm done with this, there will be no more bubbles. And this roux will not have any thickening qualities. So I'm doing significant time lapse here. Don't start this unless you've got an hour of active cooking time to give it, because you can't leave this. So we're about 35 to 40 minutes in, and I have been stirring this fairly constantly the whole time. Might walk away for just a minute, but I've been very close and watching it. I actually just pull up a stool to the stove to do this. So you see that darkness, and with my light you can't always tell, but that's chocolate covered. I'm going to move this a little bit. And there's a little oil floating on the top. We'll get rid of that later, but we didn't want this to scorch. You may hear my little Tessie back there. She's saying hello. So I'm going to move this off the heat, set it aside. Here I have a 7-quart Dutch oven, and I poured the rest of the oil in this Dutch oven. I want just enough to wilt these vegetables. And this is the onions, pepper, and celery. I'm going to sprinkle some salt on them to help them wilt. This is the Trinity. This is the basis of New Orleans cooking. And Creole or Cajun, you use a Trinity. Just like in French cooking, you use a mirepoix of onions, celery, and carrots. And you can chop these tiny if you're just using them for flavor and you're not going to cook them long. But if you're going to cook them longer, and they're also part of the vegetables in this dish, you can make them bigger. And I like to, for my gumbo, cut these, especially the peppers, fairly large. And I use red instead of green just because of the color. I think they're prettier. But green is traditional, but you can use any peppers you want. You can even use hot peppers, only it really calls for bell pepper. So I'm adding the meat in. I cut that chicken up. And I'm just going to let this all simmer together for a fairly short time. The onions and the peppers and the celery have wilted a little bit. The peppers not so much. They don't really wilt the same way. They're still a bit firm at this stage, especially cut, the bigger cut that I use for this dish. Then I'm going to add my tomato sauce, and alternatively you could use a quart of crushed tomatoes, or you could use a couple of tomatoes peeled and cut up. But the tomatoes is what makes it more Creole than Cajun. That and the seafood is about the only difference. And, you know, Cajun food is more country food. Creole food is more city food. You get more seafood and more use of tomatoes. It's more French, has more of a French influence. Creole food does. They're not a lot different. I'm stirring this roux up because it's settled a little bit as it's set, waiting for me to get ready for it. But you can get a better sense of how dark it is from this than you could earlier. You know, filming at home, I struggle with light. I have another video for gumbo, by the way, that is Cajun style gumbo. And no, I don't want to have a long debate in comments about the difference in the two. The main differences are the use of tomatoes and the use of seafood. And either one you want to make is just wonderful. So we're going to stir that all in. I want you to look at the dark richness of this. And even no matter which style of gumbo you're making, the andouille sausage is pretty consistent. And you can see I didn't add a lot of other spices, and that's because most of the spicy flavor comes from the andouille sausage. So now I'm adding my chicken broth, and I'm going to add all 2 quarts. If I had used a quart of canned tomatoes, I might add just a little bit less of the broth. But I'm making a whole big pot here. I'm making about 6 quarts. And that's because I'm going to freeze some of it for later meals. And so this is an opportunity while I'm stirring, because I just want to get everything stirred up really good. Make sure that roux is all mixed in. I failed to list garlic as an ingredient, and it will be in the info section at the bottom. I'll list all of the ingredients. About a teaspoonful of garlic, minced garlic. So this is the 2nd quart of chicken broth, and as I said, if you used a quart of tomatoes, you would probably only use a half of this quart of chicken broth or fish broth if you have it. Your homemade bone broth is perfect for this. Now you're going to notice this is pretty thin. When we finish up, we're going to have a fairly thick broth, but that will come from the okra. Your thickening in this does not come from your roux, mostly because we cooked it beyond the point where it will thicken in order to get that nice dark color. So that is all stirred in. I'm going to put a lid on this pot. It's now going to cook for about between 40 minutes and an hour, and I'll show you that. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got to add some salt, and I'll taste it later to make sure that's the right amount, but I know it's not too much because I don't there's no salt in my broth. And when I can figure out this pepper grinder, I'm going to put a healthy portion of freshly ground black pepper. And then I'm going to add red pepper flakes too. And you can gauge that depending on your andouille sausage, how hot and spicy you got it. And you don't have to add the red pepper at all. But it really brings a nice flavor. And here is, I'm going to start doing this ahead of time. Grinding up this pepper, that's kind of boring. And if I hadn't forgotten it, this is when I would have added the garlic. But there goes the red pepper flakes. My red pepper flakes are just crushed, dried peppers that my friend Zach in the Debbie's Back Porch group sent to me. He's a pepper man. And he grows the most beautiful peppers. Anyway, so I've added that, and I'm adding a bay leaf, and I would have added the garlic had I not forgotten it. I do remember it later. I almost forgot my garlic. I'm sorry. And I use the little minced garlic that you can buy in the grocery store because it's gotten difficult for me to chop up, to peel and chop garlic. So I'm using the pre-minced in a citric acid solution, and it's easy and lovely. And I'll show that to you in a few minutes. So now we're going to cover this, and I'm going to let it simmer on medium-low for about 20 minutes. The filet spice that I mentioned to you earlier is the last thing we add. And some people don't add it until they serve it. They put it on the table. People use it like pepper. So there goes the lid. That's a heavy lid. So 20 minutes, I'm going to let it simmer on medium-low. So after the first 20 minutes simmer, we're going to do a really important step that some people fail to do, and it makes all the difference in your flavor. We have a lot of fat in this gumbo, from the sausage, from the chicken, and from the added oil that we use. And by the way, I don't ever use butter in gumbo. Some people do. I don't. You know how much I love butter. But to me, this cooks too long for you to use butter. It doesn't have as good a flavor. So, but you see all this extra fat, and even when we made the roux, you saw that there was some extra fat that did not get absorbed. And you really want to get rid of most of that. So you just move your little scoop around the edges until you don't get any more fat rushing into the spoon. I failed to do this one time. I promise you want to do this. And it's not for any health reasons. I don't necessarily think the fat is unhealthy. It's for flavor reasons. You just really get a better flavor if you skim that fat away. We've layered lots of flavors in this dish, and we don't want the fat to mask them. So now the okra, and I'm using frozen okra today. Just in the freezer section, it's the sliced okra. I don't ever use whole okra pods in this because I want the, what do you call it? The juice, the thickeners to cook out of this, and that's your basic thickener. So another 20 minutes on the medium-low heat. And now my old brain just remembered the garlic, which should have actually gone in before the first 20-minute cook. And that's 1 teaspoonful of minced garlic. You want to put it in after you've added the first liquid, because you don't want it to scorch in cooking with your Trinity. I'm going to cover that up, and then we're going to talk about grits. I'm serving this with grits. You can serve it with rice. A lot of people serve grits with seafood, fried fish, or shrimp and grits. When you're going to make grits to serve with a meal like this, you want them to be creamy. So I'm using Jim Dandy Quick Grits. That's what I generally use. And I have 1 cup of water, 1 cup of milk, and a half cup of grits, and a half teaspoon of salt. I brought the liquid just to a simmer, and then I add the grits and stir them in. These are not the long cooked grits. They do need to cook about 10 to 15 minutes. So when I stir them in, I'm going to turn the heat down and just let them simmer until they're pretty thick. This is how I make my grits for shrimp and grits. See, there you go. They're getting thicker. And they will get thicker than this. I generally serve them in a scoop. The milk or the cream really adds a different texture than if you use totally water. I want to taste of these, and I'll show them to you. They're going to thicken up just a little bit more. They do have to cook about 15 to 20 minutes. Otherwise, they have little, you can feel the corn grit in them. When they're totally done, you won't feel that. You know, just a suggestion. If you want a really good addition to your breakfast, grits and red-eye gravy. So this is the end of the second 20-minute cook. So these have cooked 40 minutes total so far. And I'm going to now add the seafood. You add it last. And by the way, if you're going to freeze this, you may want to take out the part that's going in the freezer before you add the seafood. I didn't this time, but the seafood can get very easily overcooked when you heat this up. You don't want the seafood to cook more than about 3 minutes. Those are fresh shrimp. I have seen people add shrimp early, but they just, to me, get pretty rubbery. So I add those at the last 3 minutes. And then I'm going to add my filet powder. Now, a lot of people take the time to take some of the liquid out, mix the filet powder in with it. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to sprinkle it right over the top. It won't lump up or anything. You don't have to treat it like cornstarch. It's, as I say, a lot of people just serve it at table and you sprinkle the filet powder that you want into your own bowl. But I do add it while it's cooking, but it's just at the very end. And it's very difficult to explain the flavor. It might help you to know that these are sassafras leaves. Sassafras root is the basis of root beer. There's just a hint of that flavor in the leaves. So this is done. My grits are done. I'm going to plate this up, and then I'm just really going to enjoy my dinner. Because of the time and attention this takes, I don't make it very often, but I always enjoy it when I do make it. My grandson Elijah is home from the army, and he's on leave visiting with Grandma, and I made this for him. He's been stationed in Louisiana for 2 years, and he loves gumbo. So I'm getting a great big bite. It's very hot. And, you know, the flavor of gumbo is like nothing else. I'm not saying it's the best food in the world. I'm not even saying it's my favorite food. But I'm saying there's nothing like gumbo. I hope you try gumbo. I hope you love gumbo as much as I do. And I hope to see you again tomorrow.